and welcome to the Oddity Archive. The show that, rather depressingly, apparently peaked very, very early on. But before I get to that, once again, it's Thanksgiving. And once again, I'm stuck putting out a full blown regular proper archive episode on Thanksgiving Day. And given that Thanksgiving tends to not exactly be an archivism rich holiday, I'm going to, once again, take the opportunity to do a bit of self retrospective, if you will. So, with that, up until this point, I've always either pulled viewers on their favorite commercial or song or whatever to appear on archive, or I've kind of dug through my own deep cuts for material. But I'm going to do the opposite this year. So, this time around, we are going strictly commercial by archive standards, and we're going to take a look back at the archive's greatest hits. In other words, the top 10 most viewed Oddity Archive episodes according to YouTube. Now, getting back to the whole depressing thing, quite depressingly for me, 6 out of the top 10 episodes are from the first season. So, July of 2012 through June of 2013. Now, I mean, I'd like to think that has more to do with me doing less esoteric subject matter at the time, but maybe I am just that far over the hill here. Now, I should note, conversely and rather amusingly, certainly with regards to the season 1 stuff, these episodes for the most part did not do well upon their first release. So, really only the original Max Headroom incident episode, if memory serves, only that one cracked 100 views at the time. And even then, I think you had to add up the YouTube and the blip.tv counts for that. And our younger and newer viewers are going, blip. What? But anyway, yeah, I think I can safely say that most of these 10 episodes didn't get their big old view counts until much later on. So with that, let's take a look back at the top 10 archive episodes, again, according to YouTube, as of November of 2022. And given the subject matter, the kind of recurring subject matter I'm seeing, I don't foresee this list changing order anytime soon. And I should also note before I get started that I hadn't seen a solid half of these episodes since I first made them. Yeah, I was doing a lot of cringing through this. Oddity Archive. The time is now 9 o'clock. Our next program will begin in 15 minutes. Okay, I don't remember why I put that intro there. Anyway, this was about as surprising as the top 10 archive episodes got, and was one that I hadn't seen, save for the closing segment, which I soon recycled, since I made it. Looking back on it, this was very much a case of me trying to spread out, at best, 10 minutes of material over a not even 15-minute episode. If nothing else, I'd long forgotten about the tale of Carol Hersey and her clown doll Bubbles, and of course by turn BBC test card F. Incidentally, a few years later, I acquired a box of off-air VHS tapes from England, one of which had a BBC Two sign-off, complete with an appearance from Carol and Bubbles, and a perfectly good stereo audio test to boot. Actually, come to think of it, I think Carol and Bubbles may be why this episode has gotten so much mileage. I mean, there are decades worth of parodies, conspiracy theories, and entire internet-y horror stories revolving around the two of them. Ooh, weird memory. Sometime after the episode dropped, I got a threatening email from some, as I soon learned, extremely stupid and apparently quite wealthy by his country's standards, 12-year-old claiming that one of the European patterns that appeared very briefly, and I don't even remember which one at this point, was actually originally made in his little South American third world crap hole country. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. And that he was going to sick his nation's government on me for using it. Needless to say, I'm still waiting. By the way, I figured out who the kid was really easily because he was dumb enough to link me his own YouTube channel. Anyway, given my twisted mental process with this little segment here, yeah, I consider this to be a pretty unremarkable episode. Yeah, we all knew we'd be getting at least a couple of visits from old Max here. Incidentally, this is far and away the most recent episode in the top 10. Now, unlike most of the episodes in this countdown, this was a hit at the time, and I believe it still holds the record for most first day views for an archive episode. Of course, given the inexplicable, endless popularity of the story of the Max Headroom hijacking incidents, I knew this one was gonna do some business. As for the episode proper, it was mostly housekeeping on my part. When I first covered the hijackings, it was the first proper video I'd ever made. I was doing that nostalgia critic pastiche, largely because that was just the thing at the time. And no one, as far as I knew, had really tried to piece together the narrative quite yet. Add it all up, and yeah, I hit every conceivable pothole with it the first time around. So by the time the 30th anniversary of the hijackings rolled around in 2017, I had a little more experience, more things had come to light, and it seemed like a good time to close the book on it. Of course, hypocrite that I am, despite my saying I was done with it, I have given 3 more deep discussions on it. One on Gino Cuddy's Gino in the Evening talk show, one on the Bizarre channel, both in 2019, and one on the Book of Darren podcast earlier this year. Looking back on it, the first 10 or so episodes of Archive and associated minisodes touched on everything that would become a staple around here. But I think I can safely say this is the first episode where Archive started to take on its own flavor, and it was unintentional. On June 23rd, 2012, I was involved in a head-on car crash. Someone ran the opposing turn arrow and right into me. For all intents and purposes, I was okay, but I had a pretty bruised ribcage and sternum. At that time, I was in the process of editing episode number 2, Emergency Broadcast Salute. So, unsurprisingly, a few days later, or whenever it was, when I started work on episode number 3, TV Sign-Offs, I was still in some pretty good pain, and as such, I wound up mostly dropping the faux nostalgia critic thing and gave a more relatively reserved performance. Helped give it a more nocturnal feel anyway. Now, there really isn't much to say about the subject of TV sign-offs outside of describing the basic structure of the things. So, as such, I turned over the bulk of the episode to a deliberately overlong sketch, making fun of those lengthy, self-indulgent wind-downs that TV stations often gave themselves during the 70s and early 80s. Not everything works with this episode, and admittedly, I wound up picking up the quasi-nostalgia critic shtick with episode number 4, but in a weird way, it is like watching the archive, or what it's become, being born. Having said all that, the true reward of this episode for me came about a year and a half after it dropped. In 2014, I heard from an old broadcast engineer that had a Betacam or Betacam SP, I forget, copy of the actual original NASA Lonely People sign-off, which I had recreated for the end of my episode, and that sign-off was considered missing at the time. Of course, since then, a 16mm copy and an off-air copy have surfaced. You have been watching the Oddity Archive, proudly serving the fringe geek community since 2012. Well, if Orson Welles had the Mercury Theater War of the Worlds radio broadcast, I had the death of analog TV. The main difference being that I wasn't trying to freak anyone out. Of course, I think most of the views that this episode has gotten have stemmed from the, as of this episode, still ongoing uber slow death of analog television. But at the time, all I seemed to do was freak out my regular viewers with the overall framework that it was going to be the final episode of Archive, and hence my discussion of the mainstream American, at least, end of analog TV. To make matters worse, it was the final episode of the season, and I thought it would be funny to make that summer break of mine that year done ahead of time the Archive's would-be nightlight service, like how analog stations, here in America at least, didn't fully stop broadcasting for a while yet. Despite my reasons for ending Archive being completely flimsy and absurd, far too many people took it seriously. Divorced from that little scare, I thought it turned out pretty good. By this point, I'd settled into more of a groove as a presenter and had mostly streamlined the production end of things.
I know where you live beyond.
This is a test of the emergency broadcast service. For the next 16 minutes, the show will conduct a test. This is only a test.
There's a saying in the music industry that you have your entire life to write your first album and 6 months to write the second. With Archive, it was the opposite. The Max Headroom incident, episode 1, was a pretty new thing to me at the time. It was episode 2 that I had been building up long before Archive. The stories I tell about being terrified of the old EBS, Emergency Broadcast System, and not to mention the CBSI, my yelling at the EAS, Emergency Alert System, for being so inopportune, and so on and so forth, were all 100% real-life experience, save for the shooting out the TV bit. The tale of the 1971 EBS false alarm had been a favorite of mine for a while by that point. The 60s and 70s singing EBS tests were long-standing favorites of mine by that point. As such, I was able to quite easily turn that episode into a nearly 17-minute gag fest. Having said that, as far as my own interests go, it's rather distressing that civil defense broadcasting in general is such a shallow well. There's kind of a reason there have only been, in all reality, 3 dedicated civil defense broadcasting episodes of Archive in over 10 years. As for this episode proper, my delivery is still very much a rushed mess. It's way over-edited, and, well, maybe I should have waited longer to do this one.
I feel good all under. Know why I feel good all under? My Hanes underwear fits all under. Look, reinforced neck, double seams, and a waistband that doesn't dig in. What comfort. And the Hanes price makes my wallet feel good, too. Boy, do I feel good all under. Hanes makes you feel good all under. Good morning.
Now, 20% off on Hanes' best-selling men's and boys' styles.
And here's the last non-Season 1 episode of this retrospective. Anyway, this is one of those rare episodes that falls into some weird zone where it's a hybrid of history lesson, clip show, and riff session. And somehow it works. Having said that, this one is arguably more noteworthy for how many recurring archivisms it launched. For one, the TD moment, as I call it, was an existing personal joke. At the time, I was still working a day job as a tech at a live venue, and I was constantly butting heads with the resident technical director, or TD for short, in the theatrical world. He was known to cause much anxiety when he would try and sit in on a show by being a little overzealous, which led to some real live technical difficulties moments, which in time I personally and privately came to regard as TD moments, which of course I carried on to Oddity Archive. This episode also marks the debut, I think, of the Grim Reaper technical difficulties slide, which is still seen in the opening of most archive episodes today. For what it's worth, that shot dates to when the late Blip.tv dropped archive the previous October. As a bonus story here, the misspelled episode title was initially only an internal gag in the episode. Officially, technical difficulties was properly spelled. But in retrospect, rather amusingly, YouTube fairly quickly blocked this episode, and just as it had picked up over 1,000 views. Natch. The reason? They decided I was using an instrumental piece from former Mr. Big guitarist Paul Gilbert called Technical Difficulties. Of course, it doesn't appear in the episode, nor is it referenced in any way, shape, or form, but it certainly didn't stop the YouTube bots from stomping all over it. As such, once I realized the bots weren't going to let it go, I deleted it and simply reposted it with a bad phonetic spelling as the new official title. And it worked beautifully.
This is a test. This station is conducting a test of the emergency broadcasting system. This is only a test.
We're the A, we're the A, we're it every single day in the park, in the town.
Well, I have been known to call this one of my least favorite archive episodes. In fact, back on episode 64, Oddity Archive's Greatest Misses, I gave this the number 1 slot as my greatest personal failure making archive up until that point. It's just God's little joke that this is one of only 4 archive episodes to date to crack the 6 figures. Anyway, after rewatching it for the first time in several years now, it's more entertaining than I remembered, my ultra sleepy voiceover notwithstanding. Having said that, there are some glaring errors. For one, I said that Captain Midnight, John McDougal, turned himself in, which is only half true. The FCC and the media had already named McDougal as the culprit, and by turn, McDougal surrendered to authorities. He would have been soon arrested otherwise. As for the Vrillon, I was never clear on that, half of the episode, it never does address the origin of the audio of the hijacking. Actually, I don't think that audio has ever been 100% confirmed original. It also fails to mention that the associated video I ran with it was from a few years later and was only loosely related to the original footage, which, as far as I know, has not survived. Oh well. The Hester Peace Theater and Poetry Corner mini-sketches were kind of amusing.
Our production of The Scarlet Letter, the musical, a cappella. Hester Prynne, You have been found guilty of adultery.
Adultery.
Now you must wear.
Wear the
A, wear the A, wear it every single day.
And now it's time for Poetry Corner. Reading today's poem is Vrillon of the Ashtar Galactic Command.
For many years you have seen us as lights in the skies. We speak to you now in peace and wisdom, as we have done to your brothers and sisters all over this, your planet's forces that can overshadow their judgment.
This has been Poetry Corner.
I wasn't finished yet. If I had the budget, I'd vaporize you.
Thank you for watching BAF TV, your choice for quality religious and educational programming. Released one short week after Captain Midnight / Vrillon, I guess I must have been trying to save face after what I saw as the mess that was that particular episode. There was no mini-sode or anything between that episode and this one. Looking at it now, I think I can safely say that the closing segment on the Chicago-only Telefirst service, is still looking for one of those decoder boxes, by the way, was the first time I had a subject with not only a royally absurd narrative, but one with a punchline. I won't ruin it for those precious few of you that haven't seen it yet. Let's just say Telefirst was kind of the gold standard for stupid archive stories for quite some time. Of course, the real payoff for this episode, to me personally, was when I, years later, acquired an on-TV decoder box, which, with rare exceptions, has proudly sat behind me on every box segment I've done since early 2019. Also, as far as I'm concerned, this episode, as well as the infamous American Triple Ecstasy episode, at this point stands as a little pair of monuments to the, publicly speaking, missing Dr. Ripko, who inadvertently supplied much of the footage for both episodes. As a side note, I'm totally unqualified to cover it myself, but Ripko's involvement with the 80s and early 90s Chicago area freaking phone hacking scene is well worth reading about. Another episode I've been known to publicly crap on. Looking back on it, there's some good gags early on, like the opening mock FBI warning and the zooming logos mini-sketch, but mostly this episode feels transitional. A weird, uneasy mix of the early, more slideshow-driven archive and the subsequent, more host segment and footage-heavy style. To me, the last 10 minutes or so of this one still feel like a total choppy, incomprehensible train wreck, even by my low standards. But nonetheless, this is one of only 2 episodes to date that's cracked 200,000 views. I think that speaks more to the subject matter than anything else. Whatever. If nothing else, this episode, I'm pretty sure at least, marks the first appearance of the now classic, in archive land at least, Jiminy by Jimmy Fifth. Yep. No prizes for guessing what the most popular archive episode of all time is. This is the only episode to crack 500,000 views, or even 250,000 for that matter. I've discussed this thing numerous times now, so I don't think I can really add much to it. If I can make any great claim with this one, it's that, as I already mentioned, I was probably the first to really attempt to piece together the narrative. This episode is pretty outdated in every way at this point, and it's been bested at least a couple times over, and there's only two pretty minor reasons to watch it now. The Preparation H commercial parody, and to see the archives, not even baby pictures, more like the archives ultrasound. But to all those of you that have continued to give this episode, and by turn my little series, life, I can only say, you're all freaking nerds. And yes, you're better than Chuck Swirsky.
Let's all be like the yo-yo man. Rocking the baby from the palm of your hand.
Perhaps appropriately, the all-time most viewed video I've ever posted isn't even one of my own. The only archivism to ever become a meme, namely the Smothers Brothers Yo-Yo Man tape, is currently sitting at over 700,000 views on the Archive Annex channel. Somewhere down the line, the "he just kept on yoing" bit caught on. Damned if I know how or why, but damned if I understand meme culture for that matter, but there you go. I think I can safely say the meme has outlived anything I've ever done, nor anything I will ever do. And no, that is not a good feeling. For what it's worth, this was supplemental material from VHS Vault Volume 10 Learning with the Stars, released in November of 2016, and that episode, as of my making this, is still a little south of the 10,000 view mark. Well, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I continue to accept my fate as being just that little cult channel.
He just kept on yoing.
He just kept on yoing. He just kept on yoing. He just kept on yoing. He just kept on yoing.